Your subject is in shadow and your background is super bright. How do you handle that kind of extreme contrast? Got some ideas for you on today's episode of
Ask David Bergman.
Hey there everybody, welcome back. Here I am, as always, answering your photography questions right here on Adorama TV. Today's question comes from James K, and he wants to know, hey David, I photographed a daytime concert in a covered bandshell where the band was a lot darker than the fans who were in bright sunlight. I was allowed to go on stage to get shots of the band and crowd together, but I struggled with the background blowing out from the contrast. How do you handle event photography when the lighting is this extreme? Thanks, James, for sending that in. This is a scenario that's happened to me many times. Now, I've done videos about dynamic range before, but this one's a bit different because at a live event, you don't have any control over the placement of your subject. It's not like you can just pick everybody up and move them into better light. So today I'm going to explain why this situation is not ideal, and then I'm going to give you some options on how to handle it based on my own experience. So first of all, this isn't just a concert photography problem. Anytime you're photographing something that's considerably darker than the background, you're going to have a potential issue. You see, our eyes go to the brightest part of an image first when we look at a picture. So if I'm photographing a person in bright daylight, but they're standing under a covered area so that the sun isn't hitting them, they're going to probably be a lot darker than that bright background. That background's going to pull your eye away from the subject, which is not usually what you want. Now, of course, there are always exceptions for creativity, but the opposite isn't usually a problem. If your subject is bright and the background is super dark, that can be a really nice image because your subject just pops right off of the screen. Now, besides being a distraction, the other issue with a bright background is what happened to James. When he went on stage and took pictures of the band, the crowd in the background was so much brighter that they just blew out into solid white and lost all detail. The whole idea of that shot is that you want to see both the band and the crowd, but he couldn't get an exposure to show both. That does kind of defeat the whole purpose of getting on stage in the first place. So what can you do about it? Well, there are a few ways to go here. The first option is just to use flash. If your subject is close enough and your flash is powerful enough, you can light them up to match that bright background. Now, I do know that for most indoor concerts, flash isn't allowed, and even if it was, it's a distraction to the performers and everyone else at the show, so don't do that. But for a daytime outdoor situation like James described, I don't think anyone in the crowd would even notice a flash going off. The sun is so bright in their face that that little flash that you're using is probably not going to be a distraction. But that's a judgment call you're going to have to make on the scene at the time. Now, if you've got a Speedlite or a small strobe with you, that's one of the cleanest ways to solve this problem. Set your exposure first for that bright background, the way you normally would for any sunny scene, and then use your flash to bring your subject up to match. Instead of fighting the contrast, you're just adding light where it's missing, so the contrast isn't as extreme. Now here's a perfect example. A couple years ago, Luke Combs' band, who are called the Wildcards, played a few gigs outside of the stadium before Luke's headline show. They're on a stage that's a small covered stage with minimal lighting, and the crowd was in direct sunlight. Photographing from the crowd looking in was easy since the background was nice and dark, but at the end of the show, I went up on stage and turned the guys around to get a shot of them with the fans behind them. The first time I did this, I mistakenly didn't have a flash on me, so I had the exact problem that James did. I only made that mistake once though, and the next time they played, I brought my Canon EL5 Speedlite, which gave me just enough pop to light them up and show the stadium and some fans in the back. Pro tip: underexpose your subject just a little bit so it doesn't look like you used flash at all. The background is still bright so it looks natural, but you've decreased the contrast ratio enough so that the background isn't completely blown out. Just remember, a small speedlight only reaches so far, especially once you're trying to match the brightness of the sunlight. If you're not close enough, this option might not be practical, but it's worth trying. The second option is doing some work in post-processing. The most common is just working with a single RAW file and dodging and burning to bring back detail. RAW files hold a lot of recoverable information, especially in the shadows and even in the highlights if you haven't completely blown them out. So if your subject isn't a total silhouette and your background isn't pure white, there's often more to work with than you think. Let's take a look again at my first wildcards photo when I didn't have a flash. Straight out of camera, the guys are a little too dark and the background is blown out. And depending on how you work and which programs you like, you can either use the tools in your RAW converter like Capture One or Lightroom, or you can make two separate conversions at different exposures and then combine them. Now, this isn't going to be a step-by-step Photoshop tutorial video, but when the contrast is this extreme, I do find it looks better to make two conversions from the same raw file. I'll make one bright for the band and one darker one for the background. By using layer masks and large feathered brushes, I can keep the parts of each layer that I want so that the contrast is less extreme. Now, I don't like to be too precise on these because I think it looks more natural with some feathering on my masks. Now, if you're working with a subject that isn't moving, you can bracket your exposures when you're taking the pictures, because that's going to give you even more latitude than a single raw file. I recently made our end of tour group photo at Wembley Stadium in London. Now, I'd normally do this with our stage as the background, but we decided to turn it around to show the iconic stadium this year. Now, the challenge for me was taming that bright background. It was too big of a group to light up with flash, especially since I had to work quickly before doors opened for the audience. I mounted my Canon R5 Mark II camera to a ladder using a Manfrotto super clamp and magic arm so it would stay relatively still. Once everyone was in place, I very quickly took some photos at a faster shutter speed to expose for the stadium. Now, I'm still using RAW for maximum latitude and quality, but in theory, I could have done this with JPEGs. I then set my exposure for our band and crew, climbed down the ladder, ran into the shot, and triggered the camera remotely using PocketWizard transceivers. I took a large batch of images to be safe, and then we were done and I could let everybody go. Now, in post, I combined the two exposures, added one person who had to leave early because his wife had a baby. Congratulations, Kevin. I got rid of some of the people working in the background, added our tour graphics, and I've got our final shot. This worked particularly well because there's a clean separation point, like a horizon, where I can blend the two exposures, but your mileage may vary depending on what your picture looks like. Personally, I think the flash option is usually the better way to go, especially for something close up like the wildcards photos. But in this case, working on it in post got me where I wanted to be. And before I get to the third option, I want to remind you, if you've got a photography question you want me to answer, just head over to askdavidbergman.com and submit it right there on the site. If you want to keep up with everything I'm doing, thedavidbergman.com has links to my socials, my free email list, a ton of educational videos, and a few discount and affiliate links. And if you're enjoying this video, please hit like, subscribe to Adorama's YouTube channel, and tap that bell icon for notifications. It really helps us keep making free photography content for you every single week. Now, the third option, especially when you're moving around, is to just work with what you've got. Pay attention to the light and use it to your advantage even when it's not ideal. The last couple of years, Luke has hosted a fan club event called the Bootleggers Bonfire. It's a casual series of shows over 3 days in the Florida Panhandle. On the first day, we usually have a sound check. The stage isn't lit, and it's just bright empty seats and blue sky in the background. Now, of course, I have free reign to document this however I want, and I certainly keep my Speedlite on camera for when I want to add some light. But I can also get creative by exposing for the background and letting Luke go into full silhouette. By paying attention to body positions and other graphic elements, I can make some unique images that wouldn't have presented themselves in more even lighting. I actually kind of enjoy the challenge of working with the light and finding the more interesting images in tough situations. Now, of course, you don't only have to make silhouettes. You can prioritize your subject and just let the background blow out completely if you want. Neither one is right or wrong. It's a creative decision, but it should be your decision. This is one of the reasons I'm such a big believer in using full manual exposure. You're the photographer. Instead of just letting the camera decide what's correct, you can consciously make decisions on how you want your images to look. If the scene is really contrasty, it can't possibly know what you want, and the camera's going to try to average things out. Now, sure, it could make a cool exposure once in a while, but it might jump around from frame to frame, and you could lose the best moments. If you lock in your exposure manually, you decide what matters most in that frame, and it stays consistent no matter what's moving through it. I often get asked what metering mode I use, and the honest answer is that I don't use any at all. Because I'm shooting in full manual exposure, I'm just looking at the image in real time through my mirrorless camera's electronic viewfinder. I can actually see it as I'm shooting it. If I were using any auto exposure mode and let's say I was spot metering on Luke's face, the camera wouldn't give me the silhouette that I wanted in this case. It would also be really hard to keep the spot right on his face at all times when I'm trying to compose an image. Now, yes, I know there are some advanced metering modes that are going to prioritize a face, and I suppose you could use exposure compensation to get close, but why bother? I don't want the exposure to change at all when I'm making pictures like this. I can just lock down all 3 exposure triangle settings and not have to think about it. So James, I feel for you, man. I know you were in a tough situation, but there are some solutions you can work on next time. If it's appropriate and possible, try to get a flash on your subject. That's often my first choice, especially if I'm close enough. If your subject isn't moving much, blending two exposures in post can get you there too. Or just go full manual, decide what matters most in the frame, and either embrace the silhouette or let the background go. What about you all? Have you run into this kind of extreme contrast? How did you handle it? Let me know down in the comments below. And then check out my video somewhere on screen here called Dynamic Range is Overrated. It goes a little deeper into reading the light and working with what you've got instead of worrying about your camera's specs and not having enough stops of range to capture everything. Thanks so much for watching Adorama TV. I'll see you next time right here on Ask David Berg.